resources for today. There are two we'll be looking at. One that I hope is really helpful for you. It's labeled 4-30 handout. And then for our practice today, it is labeled 4-30 AP practice. You can access that in the video description. You might need to click show more, or you can use the URL that's on the screen and then just scroll to 4-30, and then we'll get started in about 30 seconds. All right, good afternoon. I'm Mrs. Velitis. I just want to give a quick shout out or a little hello to Jessica Shaw from California, and then to everyone else who's joining us. This is one of my last sessions, so it's exciting to see you guys here, and we're almost there. You're almost to the point of the AP exam. You're getting closer to it. I'm a dinosaur, and I'm going to date myself, and I'm aware of that. But every year, April 30th is one of my favorite days to be a teacher because I'm so old. But I use this meme every year on April 30th. And so since you're my students, my virtual students today, you get to reap the benefit of this meme. It's one of my favorites. Of course, I'm a 90s lover because, again, I'm a dinosaur. And that tonight we might be watching some Bye 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 from NSYNC on repeat just to celebrate that tomorrow it's gonna be May. Anyways, well, good to see you. Before we get started with today's lesson, we're gonna do a brief warm-up reviewing yesterday's activity. Mrs. Knight was really focusing on how you can add some cohesion to your body paragraphs, and she gave you several things that you could consider doing in your writing, such as relating back to your claim, relating back to the rhetorical situation, thinking about relationships between examples, and even including some transitions will help you to add cohesion to your writing, excuse me. And she gave you a student sample, a body paragraph, and asked you to read through it and identify where you saw that student making some of those relationships explicit. For today's purposes, if you didn't participate in yesterday's lesson, maybe you pause the feed and read through the paragraph quickly and highlight or underline, or maybe you take little notes in the annotation or in the margins of where you see some of these things occurring. Everyone else, I will show you what we saw as some of the answers for this. We might have annotated the passage like this, where we start with the claim, which is what is the student claiming to prove in this body paragraph. And then as you can see, the student makes his or her way through the body paragraph. And you might want to do a pause as well here just to look at how we've color coded. And if there is a particular area to see if you marked it the same way or not. I'll keep moving, but feel free to pause if you want to do a closer look. I just wanted to highlight a few things. Like first, this is a really strong body paragraph. The student has excellent commentary. The student does a fantastic job. As you can see, just visually looking at the colors, the student does a really great job of relating to the claim, which is in purple, and then relating to the rhetorical situation, which is in blue. And that's what I think is really important to remember when it comes to writing this particular essay, the rhetorical analysis essay. On May 20th, maybe you just keep asking yourself over and over again, am I relating back to my claim? Am I relating back to the rhetorical situation as explicitly and as thoroughly as possible? Recognizing relationships between examples are important. And then today we'll talk about the importance of transitions. But when it comes to your commentary, as you can see here with this great sample, the more blue and purple you have, the better. All right, so as you noticed, yesterday Mrs. Knight spoke a little bit about transitions, but today we're going to do a much deeper dive. And I think a lot of students know of transitions and you use them, but today's lesson is really going to focus on how it's more than just a word being used here and there. And we're going to focus on what are good transitions to include in your writing and when and where to use them. And you can see these are on the screen, these are the standards that we use as AP teachers And one of the things that you'll notice is that they are addressing that coherence occurs paragraph to paragraph, from one example to another example, and even at this really small level of sentence to sentence. So we'll be looking at how can you add more cohesion and more fluidity to your writing through the use of transitions. Transitions are incredibly important to your writing. They guide your reader. They are highlighting the line of reasoning, helping your reader, to go through it step by step. So not only does it communicate your line of reasoning, it's going to guide your reader through that. Sometimes it's going to be a really good wake-up call to your reader and signal a new idea is about to be presented. And then obviously it's going to add some cohesion. It's going to make your sentences build upon each other and flow so much more. To help you in the resources, I've given you a handout that I'm going to reference all day today. It has a series of sentence frames, and basically a sentence frame is a sentence that you can plug right into your essay at various points, like before a second paragraph or before you introduce your commentary. You might think about it kind of as though it's like a fill in the blank sentence, and you just add the appropriate words in the blank. So for example, I might give you one sentence frame that looks like this. At the start of the passage, the writer, and then give you a blank, a space to fill in. You would maybe write something like, uses repetition to emphasize the importance of the battle. So whenever you see a blank, that's when you would kind of plug in any information that pertains to your particular prompt or example or writing in general. I think that what's tough with transitions is that this is something you need to practice on your own in writing assignments over the next few weeks, even if this is going to sound silly, but even if you're emailing your teacher, or if your teacher poses a question like on a worksheet or something, maybe you practice using some of these transitions or record a few when you're looking at the handout or going through our presentation today. Maybe you record 4 or 5 that you think are really easy for you to remember and are really natural to your writing style in general. And you write those on your exam notes page. So keep that in mind as we're going. And I will say, a lot of these sentence frames come from a fantastic resource called They Say, I Say. And this is something that I read. I'm again a dinosaur, so not an undergraduate, but when I was in grad school, I had 2 classes where the professors made it required reading. And I know that some of my students will graduate, they'll come back and they'll say that this is the textbook that a lot of their professors have them read, not in their English classes, that it's in a science class or a business law class or something. It's a great resource because they'll give you a lot of templates. And I've pulled some that I think will be helpful for a rhetorical analysis, but I would recommend you either checking it out from the library, getting your own copy. And I think a lot of copies of the book are available online, so you might be able to check it out there too. So one way you can add a transition or add some cohesion to your writing is from one paragraph to the next. So like from your introduction to your first body paragraph, or from your first body paragraph to your second. We're even going to look at how you could add a transition to your conclusion. When you're transitioning from one paragraph to the next, typically students like to use transitional words like first, second, next. And those are fine. It's better than no transition at all. So those are fine. However, you might want to consider using a phrase, something that has multiple words in it, to really help ease your reader into your next paragraph, like any of these. And how you go about transitioning really depends on how you've organized your essay. So I have transitions for both types of paragraphs that I think or essays you guys might be writing. The first here is if it's writing more about the chronology or the ideas, meaning the first half of the passage and the second, or by strategies or the ideas. And you might transition to a new paragraph by briefly mentioning the idea, something like this. You might say, the writer opens the passage with a scientific tone. So you're kind of like easing us into that. Then when you move into your second body paragraph, it might be something like this. The writer shifts from a scientific to an impassioned tone. So that's something you might be able to use if you are organizing your essay by the beginning and the end of the passage or by ideas. However, a lot of you organize your body paragraphs in your essay around a particular choice the writer has made. If so, you might consider doing some sort of a transition where you briefly reference the choice from the first paragraph and then move into the ideas or the choice of the second. So instead of using the common transition in a second body paragraph, like another technique the writer uses is blank, you might try something like this. Beyond incorporating repetition, the writer further conveys that Reagan was a great man by highlighting the traits or by highlighting his traits and values. So you can again kind of plug in that first line would be a brief few words reference to the first paragraph, and then the second moves into your next choice. Conclusions are tough for so many reasons. One, a lot of you don't have the time in the end to really commit to a strong conclusion. They're usually rushed at the very end. They're hard to fit in, but a lot of students kind of default to this generic in conclusion, comma, and then they move into their concluding paragraph. But that's a little overused. So you might consider using something where you're referencing the big ideas of the essay or the choices, and then you're moving into the big picture, like this one. You could maybe take this sentence frame, and if it were in an essay, it might sound something like this. By exploring Reagan's politics and values as a man, the writer suggested his memory should be held in high regard. Another good thing about that is when you're transitioning to those bigger ideas, it might help you address the broader context, which is good for the sophistication point. So beyond transitioning from one paragraph to the next, which I think a lot of you do and you're pretty good at, you can also transition within a body paragraph. So don't forget about that. It might be from one example to the next in the same body paragraph. It might be from your example into your commentary, and then it could even be from one sentence to the next. So I'm going to give you some examples again for each of those, and then try to highlight what that might sound like in an essay. So if you were to, in a body paragraph, have two examples, a lot of students might have one example, and then for the next, write something that's kind of rote or basic, like another example of repetition is when the writer says, again, that's great. That's better than nothing at all. But there are more nuanced ways to introduce a second example, like one of these. Like you could signal an addition, or you could, again, provide a brief reference to what came before it. If it is another example in the same body paragraph, it makes sense that they're related or that they build upon each other. So I recommend using any kind of language that will signal an addition. Verbs like reiterated, echoes, advanced, or further realized shows that that new example is going to build upon what we already know. So it's going to indicate a relationship without the generic. Another example is when, and it does, another way you can do this is to provide a brief reference to the previous example. That will help to add some cohesion from one example to the next. It's going to create a bridge between those two examples. But I would say that the trick is to make sure you keep it brief. Just a few words like, there we go. While the use of repetition is effective, the writer also embeds imagery to appeal to the audience. And the rest of the example will focus on an image and how it appeals to the audience. Another could be something like the second one. Other than repetition, the writer also incorporates imagery to appeal to the audience. In this case, it's a different example. Or after repeating the phrase finely and precisely, the writer then creates an image of the man's funeral. Again, these are just some things that you could plug into an essay other than another example is. And that's kind of the goal, is to help your fluidity of your writing, your cohesion, and make it seem more natural, more like your own language. When you are transitioning out of an example, there are some things that you could be doing. So a lot of times students will give an example and then they'll just write, this shows, which is fine. But if you're like my students, sometimes you overuse that within your essay and it becomes a little repetitive. So it's an example, this shows, an example, and then this shows. So try to at least mix it up a little bit. I don't think there's anything wrong with this shows, but just try to mix it up. And you might consider having a more nuanced transition like any of these. And it depends on what your function is. So you might give an example or a quotation, and then you want to explain it. This will be more content-based. It's going to clarify the purpose of the example or tell the reader what you want them to recognize. So it could be something like, there you go. The writer conveys that Reagan maintained a sense of humor even after an assassination attempt. It's kind of like describing what the quotation is telling us. It's highlighting to the reader what you want us to look at. Or it could be about the choice itself and not summarizing the quotation, but about the choice, like by incorporating imagery, the writer is helping the reader picture the scene. So you're explaining how that choice operates in that example. To transition out of your example and explaining it and into your analysis, you might focus more on the argument itself or what the example signifies or reveals more so than just summarizing the content. So it might be something like this. While Albright is exploring the high expectations that graduates have set for themselves, the real issue she's espousing is the power of women's rights. Or another one that I actually use quite a bit and encourage my students to use just because it's simple and easy and quick is the word ultimately. So like ultimately, the writer argues for gender equality. Again, these will help you pull into that broader context, which is something that will help you to earn the sophistication point. I think that a lot of students are familiar with some of these transitions, but the trickiest one, I think, the trickiest way to add the cohesion is from one sentence to the next. Some students will have a really choppy sentence structure and often use sentences that have very little variety, like the writer provides imagery. The image is of the river devouring itself. The writer is conveying the force of the river. That all the sentences are kind of short and choppy. They all start the same with the. So try to think about how could you combine your sentences or link information from one sentence into the next in order to make it more fluid. And this is a challenging concept that I will say in my class we practice, I would say off and on over 2 or 3 weeks. So it is something that's tricky and it does take a lot of practice, but once you get used to it, it kind of becomes like second nature to you. And it's good because it will help increase the fluidity of your sentences, which also then helps your reader follow the pattern of your reasoning. And it's called the known new contract. If I knew who created this, I would give that person credit. I don't, but I will say that I've pulled some of this information from a writing center pamphlet that I thought communicated it pretty clearly, which is the goal for these kinds of sessions when I can't sit and work directly with you like I would with my students. But the basic concept of the known new contract style of writing is that in a sentence, you're going to start by reminding readers of known information at the start of the sentence. Then you'll finish the sentence with new information. And this is nice because they already know the information, so they're kind of easing into your writing a little bit. It's going to bridge each sentence with each other. And that one sentence will refer to the previous information and the new. It's going to help the reader remind them of what they just read while also extending them into something new. So to do this, you'll start by writing a sentence and think, what is something my writer or my reader already knows? I'm going to put that briefly at the first part of the sentence and then think, how can I extend that idea and transition into new information that has not been shared with them? So let me give you a quick sample. By repeating the word choice, the writer is emphasizing that she made the decision to name herself Cripple. I've highlighted in orange by repeating the word choice. That's something that I know I've stated that my readers already know because I just gave the example itself. I had a sentence before that's something like, Nancy Mears repeats the word choice or something. So that's something they already know. I'm going to put that at the start of the sentence. Then I'm going to add new information, typically about how it functions or what its effect is. So in the blue, I wrote, the writer is emphasizing that she made the decision to name herself cripple. So we have both new and known information in the same sentence. Then after you've written that one sentence, you go to your next sentence and you think, what is something from the previous sentence that I want to address just briefly, a few words, not too much, just briefly before I start moving into the new part of the sentence. And you might use pronouns or introductory phrases to help connect those two. So for example, I'm going to go back at my previous sentence and think, what is something that is known to them at this point? And I think that the point that I'd really want to highlight is that she made the decision to name herself cripple. So that's what I'm going to put toward the beginning, something like this. Selecting this word to describe herself, it gives a brief nod to the previous sentence. Now, I need to add new information. I need to explore the effect. I need to extend the idea just a little bit. And I'm going to think about why she chose this word to name herself. So I'm going to add new information like, by selecting this word to describe herself, it gives Mears power over an illness that has ultimately left her powerless in a physical sense. So for both of these sentences, I have a little bit of new, or a little bit of known, excuse me, then I'm going to add new. A little bit of known, and then I'm going to add the new. It helps your sentences feel as though they are connected, again, like they're bridged by each other. Let's look at one example that I referenced, I think last week. All these days are blending together, but I think last week of how professional writers might do this. So we're going to look at the Declaration of Independence and really just the very opening of it. In it, we see we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they, in this case, I'm like, who is the they? That's known information, that they, all the men who are created equal. So they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these, which are the certain unalienable rights, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, and I would ask myself, okay, well, which rights did I just refer to? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. If we were to write it out and color code it again, just to help clarify again, it would look something like this. That they is what is known, because he's already told us that all men are created equal. So we already know that. The new information is that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Then in the next phrase, next clause, it's that among these, which is referring to certain unalienable rights, and he's going to add on to it life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then again, to secure these rights is referencing the rights of the previous clause, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he's going to add new information by saying that governments are instituted among men, ... So that's one way you might color code if that's easier for you to see it. Thomas Jefferson was a whiz kid, so I don't know that you'd be writing something as complex as this, but I did want to give you another example. So the no new contract, as I said, it is tough, especially in a timed setting. And I really think realistically, like what I would tell my students if I were delivering this to them is don't get overwhelmed by it. The more you practice it, the more innate it will become. Follow the steps I just guided you through. And maybe you aren't doing it every single sentence. Maybe you're just thinking of a few sentences here and there. Do what you can do. Don't feel like every sentence has to fit in this known new format. So maybe you write a sentence and then just ask yourself, how could I reference this in my next sentence? Or, because I'm tricky like that, another easy solution would be to use those sentence frames I just gave you. And it's on that handout, because if you go back and you study them, a lot of them kind of naturally follow this known new format. For example, in the paragraph to paragraph, I've highlighted for you where we have the known information versus the new. So thinking about that very last one that's color coded, the example I gave before was, beyond incorporating repetition, the writer further conveys that Reagan was a great man by highlighting his traits and values. Beyond incorporating repetition is known information. You just talked about that in the previous paragraph. Your reader already knows it. You're going to add new information with, the writer further conveys that he was a great man by highlighting his traits and values. Or, I mean, in the example to example, all of those fit that format naturally. So the example that I gave earlier was under the reference previous example, the second bullet point. Other than repetition, the writer also incorporates imagery to appeal to the audience. Other than repetition is something that was referenced in an earlier example. Now I'm going to add new information, what the writer also incorporates. So you get the idea. Even when we move from example into commentary, a lot of these sentence frames kind of naturally follow it anyway. So again, maybe you pull out 4 or 5 sentence frames and you write them on your notes page that you think are easy for you to use. They're ones that you know you would feel comfortable using that also will add that sentence to sentence cohesion as well. So just a quick review. Transitions are important to your writing, primarily because of the effect that they will have on your reader, how they will help your reader to see when a new idea is being presented, to guide your reader through your line of reasoning. And then we talked about how transitions occur paragraph to paragraph, from one example to the next. You might even transition from an example into your commentary, and then at its most narrow level from one sentence to the next, which is the hardest to do. But that ultimately, transition words are good, but try to shoot more for transitional phrases that reference previous ideas, even if just in like 2 or 3 words. For your AP practice night, I have a student sample for you. And what you have here is basically the first body paragraph. I've not given you the intro, but the first body paragraph. And then you'll see sentence 10 is the start of the second paragraph. Again, I didn't give you the whole paragraph because I just thought that that might confuse you or overwhelm you. So we're really going to focus on 4 places where you could add a transition. You might look at sentence 3, 4, 5, and 10. So if you look more closely, you'll see here the student gives an example in sentence 2. Therefore, I'm going to ask you to create a transition at the start of sentence 3 that might explain that quotation a little bit. Then a transition at the start of sentence 4 that's going to analyze it a little bit more, and then possibly at sentence 5 if you can fit that in as well. Then think about how you would transition from one paragraph to the next. And I've given you the student's topic sentence of the second body paragraph. Specifically, think about how could I reference briefly the first paragraph while transitioning into my second. So keep that in mind. Some of you might just pull directly from that handout I've provided or one of those transitional statements and again, plug things in as appropriate. Others might say, I'm just going to use a word. And again, that's absolutely permissible and fine. So you might just have one word, again, like a similarly or in addition, a really short phrase. For some of you, you might say, you know what, I'm a pro at transitions and I'm just going to create my own and weave it into the sentence. Whatever you would like is up to, whatever you like to do is up to you. But I do want you to practice weaving in some transitions to add fluidity. This body paragraph is really good in terms of content. It's really good in terms of analysis. They just need a little bit of help with the execution, with the writing style of it. So if you can add some fluidity to it, I think it would be a fantastic paragraph. Okay, that's it for today. I hope you guys have a great Thursday, and we will see you for our last review session tomorrow. Have a great day.